as well.
Senator Naughton and then Deputy Walsh.
Thank you, Chairman. I just have a question in relation to the EIA assessments that are carried out, and if somebody could elaborate on your particular concerns in that area with regard to these wind farms. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Naughton. Deputy Walsh.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks for your presentations. A lot of the questions that I had intended to ask you've answered already and have been asked obviously by other members. But just in relation to these contracts that landowners are being asked to execute, to sign. Look, it's easier to understand why landowners or farmers who are experiencing financial distress at the moment that they might be encouraged to sign these as an additional revenue stream for them. But information that I'm hearing is that, the sales pitch that they hear and the glossy magazine that they get at the doorstep or around their kitchen table, that it's in many instances dramatically different from the actual contract that arrives in the post subsequent to that. And given the nature of the individuals involved, farmers, if they shake hands on a deal around the kitchen table, they're very unlikely to withdraw from that once the paperwork arrives subsequently. So, if that is the case, look, it's unacceptable that they're being hoodwinked in this way. And can you expand a little bit on how exactly they're going from an initial lease to an option that extends over their entire holding, perhaps? And could I ask about the opportunity to disengage from those contracts? Is there break clauses, for example, in leases? And what would your assessment be of their representative body, the IFA, and the role that it is playing in assisting vulnerable farmers and distressed farmers in this whole scenario? What's your views on the role they're playing in relation to this? And just, you mentioned about land being changed from agricultural to industrial. Does that mean that they stick to existing development plans, or are there requests coming forward to rezone lands around the counties involved? Thanks, Chairman.
Deputy Stan, you have a final question, I understand.
Yeah, I was very quick at the start. Just one of the questions asked was in relation to regulations versus guidelines. Just the panel's view on that. Just on the question of the moratorium and the legality, that if that's tested, I'd be happy enough to have it tested, and haven't proposed that all of us sign up to it in the Dáil. Is that if the Attorney General says that it's not legal, we can bring in emergency guidelines, for 2 kilometres at a distance for 6 months until we get proper regulations in place. So there is ways. We don't have our hands tied behind our backs on that one, and we shouldn't allow them to be tied behind our backs on it. And just in relation to the county development plan, strategic infrastructure bill pushed through in terms of previous governments here, that will obviously, gives developers like this huge power in terms of being able to sweep away local government. The local councillors that Deputy Cowan referred to, who are at local meetings trying to deal with this, that they can make the county development plan. In the case of County Laois, they're going mainly outside of the areas designated in the county development plan, down on flat grasslands. And I would like to know the panel's view on that. Why do you think they're doing that? Because they're not necessarily going for areas. I don't know. I'm not able to measure wind, but there wouldn't appear to me areas such as Vickerstown in County Laois, for example, and Ballybrittis wouldn't be areas that would strike me as the windiest parts of Laois. And why do you think they're going for those areas?
Fine, Deputy Penrose, then back to our visitors. And
do the community groups represented here today feel that they fail to implement the EIAS, and how will the proposed SEA work, and particularly in relation to Article 3 of the EIA, all the factors are outlined? How do you propose? Because that's going to come for public consultation where you'll have a role. But what do you see as the important factors that can be put forward so as to ensure that what Deputy Cowan says, this SEA will actually incorporate the whole area? It won't be recited in any isolated area. It will cover everything.
Okay, I'll go back to you, Mr. Kennedy.
With regard to the employment opportunities that are going to be created, the 55,000 that's bandied about, have you made contact with, and we're told that the Industrial Development Authority are very much in support of this, have you made contact with the IDA in relation to their claims that this number of jobs will be created?
The IDA and the jobs, the numbers of jobs.
Just to deal with that very, very quickly, we know that if there were substantial jobs, we'd expect the Minister Bruton to be down in Tullamore and Mullingar making an announcement on those jobs. We know there are going to be a significant number of jobs in the short term for construction only, but the figures are confusing because they're given out in man-years as opposed to specific number of jobs. We also know that in the longer context, in terms of operation and maintenance, the industry guide is that there's about 0.3 jobs per turbine. So if you have a wind farm of 10, you're likely to have 3 jobs, and they're generally not local. But I'd like to refer to the earlier questions back to Nora Fagan.
Okay, Ms. Fagan. Thank you.
Deputy Cowan and Deputy Walsh and Deputy Stanley, thanks very much for your questions. I think they all touched on the same issue. I mean, what you're saying is absolutely correct, Deputy Cowan. I mean, you have to ask the question, how can these contracts and leases be enforceable when the representations made to the farmers on their doorsteps were so grossly different? But the reality, Deputy Cowan, is the profile of most of the farmers that have signed up to these is they're economically under strain as it is. I have given them my own personal opinion on what they've signed, and they have all said to me, Nora, we often worry about having enough diesel to put in our Jeep. How are we going to take on big multinationals? So there's a feeling of powerlessness with the farmers, and many of the farmers who've signed this. Unfortunately, Deputy Cowan, I would have to say there's also a certain amount of arrogance with these particular wind farm companies I'm talking about. They're bandying the fact that they have government support. They're bandying the fact that they have Deputy Rabbit support. They're also advising farmers, which is very relevant, that they're applying to be, that their wind farms, that they have a current application pending with On Board Pleanála, that their developments should be considered as part of the national infrastructure. And I've checked that myself, and that is actually correct. One of these huge wind farm developments, over 40 of them, there's a current application pending. So if you're a small farmer, which many of them are, you feel absolutely hopeless and helpless against this situation. And I do very much welcome Deputy Walsh's question as to the lobby groups such as the IFA. The IFA are becoming aware of the problem, but they have to absolutely become more proactive. Have I answered the questions?
Question in relation to the guidelines versus regulations, and in relation to the county development plans, why do you think they're moving outside of those areas? Now, I know the point you made in relation to the strategic infrastructure, that's the point I was making, but they seem to be blatantly doing that and aggravating local communities. Why do you think they're going at that, not necessarily going into areas where they might get actually better results in terms of wind speeds? But the regulations versus guidelines, that's a question I've asked twice. You know, your views on that.
I know that this ties in with a couple of questions that have been asked. Deputy Cowan's one that turbines are getting bigger. They're not only getting bigger, they're moving from uninhabited areas in the distant background into inhabited areas. And we would be particular supporters of Willie Penrose's or Deputy Penrose's bill currently in the private members arena, and also prior to that Senator John Kelly's bill. So we certainly feel that regulation as opposed to guidelines would be infinitely better, absolutely. Unfortunately, the Maynooth ERA report, which was a report commissioned by Maynooth University in relation to the impact after setback distances as devised in Willie Penrose's bill, would have left only 3% of the country viable, according to that report, for wind turbine development. If that is all that's viable, then that is all that's viable. There are 200,000 acres of cutaway bog, absolutely appropriate for this, and people must be protected. All we are here to do is to say we are not anti-wind, and this has to be stressed at every opportunity. We are actually very much pro-wind, but it's all about correct and proper and transparent planning and protecting communities. And I think we've heard numerous concerns here today. Pretty much every one of them could be assuaged, as Deputy Flanagan has said, by appropriate setback distances. Practically every one of these can be completely diminished via appropriate setback distances, as per Deputy Penrose's bill. So we would certainly be in favour of legislation, and that bill to come out of private members' arena and into the public domain, I think, would be yeah.
Mr. Kennedy.
Okay, I think there was a number of questions there from Deputy Penrose, Deputy Naughton, Deputy Murphy in relation to EIAs and how we would see that actually taking place. I think it's important to point out, like, we've had significant challenges just trying to unravel what's supposed to actually happen, as dictated by the 1985 directive on EIAs. And it's quite apparent, even talking to senior planners in the local council, that there is confusion in terms of what needs to be done. It now seems quite clear that the EIA directive would say that the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement, which is produced by the developer, is then, as part of the planning application, is then subject to an environmental impact assessment. Not just the EIS, but also that the competent planning authority would tackle all of the direct and indirect effects of the development on the environment. We note that with the 2006 guidelines, it does cover landscape, it does cover some of the elements, but it doesn't cover the impact on material assets. And these are required under Article 3 of the EIA directive. It also doesn't look at the impact on humans. So, to Deputy Penrose's, how would it actually happen on the ground? Well, it certainly would expect that the developer, the developer's contract body, would identify sensitive receptors within certain distance of wind farms, that they would go and assess the current base level of health of those sensitive receptors, that it would look, for example, and I would refer more to Andrew Duncan from an auctioneer perspective, but in terms of material assets, perhaps looking at the revenues database for the current value of the material assets in an area and looking at it at 500, 1K, 1.5, 2 kilometre radius, and looking at the impact. So getting a baseline reading and looking at the impact on material assets. But certainly what we're seeing at the moment is, when you look at any token implementation of the EIA directive, it really is birds and bats which are really getting a better look in than any of the humans. And that's a very clear context at the moment. I think that we could say that, ask the committee if you are aware of a single example of where an EIS has looked at the nighttime noise guideline, for example, of 43 decibels, and how that impacts on homes in the region, in proximate area of a developed wind farm. I certainly, I'm not aware of any, but I'm not in a position to be aware of that either. But I would ask the committee if you've come across any examples. So I think that right now it's very clear, and has been clear from the case in March 2011 from the European Court of Justice, in terms of the lack of formal implementation of the EIA directive, which I believe is now in place, that there are some weaknesses. But yet, I think right now there isn't an open and transparent mechanism that we see for the impact on material assets, for the impact on humans, the impact on flora and fauna, and the interaction of those effects, and how they can all be taken together. So that certainly doesn't fill us with confidence in the planning system, because we can't see that that type of analysis is going to be done.
Okay. That concludes our consideration. I want to thank the visitors here present this afternoon for engaging with the committee. I would urge the members to reflect on the exchange we've had. We'll return to the issue in private session next week to discuss our response to it, and any views that you might have in the meantime, please direct them towards the clerk. Visitors, thank you very much indeed. You are free to go. Thank you very much indeed. You're welcome, Deputy.